Welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. It is Tuesday, and Tom Brady has officially retired. I suppose we could devote the entire podcast to discussing that. Dana Milbank joins me, nationally syndicated columnist for the Washington Post. By the way, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Charlie.
Okay, so I'm a Green Bay Packer fan, but I think that there's no real way to argue that Tom Brady's not the greatest of all time. It pains me to say it. I want to not like the guy, but you can't make the case unless you want to.
No, the only risk here is that just because he's confirmed his retirement doesn't mean that he will, in fact, be retired tomorrow or the
That's
next
right.
day or the day after that. So he may have future seasons yet to disprove the thesis. But
Well, that's true. Well,
yeah.
we went through that with the whole Brett Favre on again, off again,
Mhm.
tearfully and showing up someplace else.
Right,
But
right.
I don't know. It's been a wild and crazy ride, and he retires at the end of arguably what's so far been the most exciting playoff football pretty much ever. Are you a football fan? I'm
Well,
uh,
so I grew up a New York Jets fan, and that
sorry.
it might have poisoned me against
Uh,
against the whole thing. And of course, living in Washington, you have the very difficult position of wanting to root for the Washington football team, but against its owner. So I've been wrestling with that a great deal. So no, it's really quite difficult.
So one of our listeners just sent me a quote that I probably should have used in my newsletter today, my palate cleanser newsletter today about Thomas Massey's latest incredibly stupid tweet. Somebody sent me Hanlon's razor, which is, of course, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity.
Hmm.
And that's a good reminder. I'm talking about Thomas Massey, the crazy Republican from Kentucky, who tweeted out what he thought was a Voltaire quote. I mean, this is so good. You mustn't question Fauci, for he is science. And then he has this Voltaire quote alleged: "To learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize." Okay, and then there's this big hand coming down on free thinking Joe Rogan podcast listeners or something like that. Well, you can't make this up. As you know, it's not Voltaire. Voltaire never said anything like this. The
Hmm.
quote actually comes from this guy named Kevin Strum, who's a neo-Nazi who pleaded guilty in 2008 to possession of child pornography. So it's this trifecta of just pure awfulness, and he was referring to the Jews and everything. So
Oh,
Thomas
that is
Massey,
fabulous, because usually these quotes are, mistakenly attributed either to Martin Luther
yeah,
King
right.
or Oscar Wilde or Mark Twain, but now to go to go straight to the Nazis, that's brilliant.
Well, it is, and you can just sort of see Thomas Massey sitting around, who once bragged about being the craziest son of a bitch on the ballot, going, "Okay, I'm going to show my education by quoting the French philosopher Voltaire," and he ends up with a Nazi pedophile. I mean, it's
That's
just,
that is excellent.
I,
I
I'm
mean,
so, I'm sorry.
he and his colleagues have made a career sort of misquoting the framers and the founders. So, but this is a new element.
It is.
I'm glad you've highlighted it.
And the fun part, of course, is that he hasn't taken it down yet. He's
No, because
it's
he's not.
it no.
He probably thinks Voltaire is a neo-Nazi.
Well, that's right, and look, you just can't apologize these days, right? And Marjorie Taylor Greene's going to come in and defend him, and he's probably going to raise money
Sure,
about
sure.
all
No,
this. But I feel the need to search out these nuggets these days because otherwise your head would explode. So
the-
speaking of that, before we get into whole, the what we're learning about the Trump coup, the former president just put out a statement a few minutes ago, calling on the January 6th committee to investigate Mike Pence. So, I mean, okay, just
I'm sure they'll
well,
take that one right up.
so let's back into that though. I loved your piece about the blizzard of snowflakes in the red states. Your latest column, your column from Friday in the Post, discusses the whole thought police problem. Which, since we're talking about neo Nazis and Nazis and everything, talking about
Mhm,
this rural county in Tennessee that last week banned Mouse, the Pulitzer Prize winning graphic novel by Art Spiegelman,
mhm.
which teaches kids about the Holocaust by portraying Jews as mice and Nazis as cats. And it was apparently that was not the disturbing part for the school board folks in Tennessee? That wasn't it? There were
Uh,
some naughty words?
yes, it was the naughty words, and I think there was some mouse nudity or or something else that they found objectionable. So this may be another case of somebody bumbling into something rather than doing it out of malice. But I thought it was terrific that now they're afraid of cats and mice, and it was almost exactly 100 years ago that Tennessee had the problem with Darwin's monkeys. So I pointed out that it does not appear that the volunteer state is evolving. We seem to be right back where we were 100 years ago. We're now talking about banning books, but I suppose it's progress.
Well,
We're now banning mice instead of monkeys.
as you point out, and this is the state that once celebrated Davy Crockett, now is afraid of a cartoon mouse exposing kids to, bad language. I mean, you really can't get more snowflakey than that, right?
Yeah, it's
So
tragic, but you know what's going to happen now. You're going to be accused of being an elitist for pointing out that the gentleman from Kentucky has gotten Voltaire wrong,
right.
and I'm going to be exposed as an elitist for pointing out that Tennessee has been a little bit backward of late on the whole evolution thing.
Yeah, with apologies to David French, who actually lives there. I think in this county, you might be considered an elitist because you've actually read a book. So I'm okay. Here we go. So I
Oh,
mean,
we're in
yeah,
trouble.
but I mean, there have been these book bans. Toni Morrison's been banned in St. Louis. Margaret Atwood had
Mhm,
*Handmaid's Tale* was banned in a suburb of Wichita,
mhm.
appropriately enough, as well as other books. So you did a little research on this. I mean, how widespread is this? I mean, we get the anecdotes, but how serious is this as a
Well,
problem?
so a couple of points on that. So I talked to the American Library Association. They counted between 300 and 400 in just 3 months. They didn't have December yet, so it was September, October, November of last year. That is roughly the same amount from an entire year in 2019. 2020 is kind of skewed because of the pandemic and schools were closed. So we're now at the 4 times the pace of these book bannings or attempts at banning. And at the same time, we've got 10 states now. Some states have done more than one law. So there's 12 of these, sort of gag laws or memory laws saying you may not teach history in thus and such a way. And, generally it's, or often it's phrased as if it makes any student feel uncomfortable, which I think can be read as any white student feeling uncomfortable. So, and then, in a state like Virginia, where the governor can't get that through the legislature, he's instead got a hotline saying, call and report on a teacher if they're saying anything divisive. So these things are much more dangerous than one isolated rural county banning one book from the library, because how many people does that affect? But there's this crazy chilling effect going on. I mean, if you're a teacher, you're just going to stay away from any. Why would you discuss slavery? Why would you discuss civil rights? You're just asking
Well,
for
especially with there's
discipline.
a tip line, and that's the as we enter into Black History Month. If you are a teacher, you really do have to sit down and go, okay, what can I say about Reconstruction?
Right? Yeah.
How much of history just sort of has to be rah rah, and what about the ugly parts? What if
Yeah.
telling some of the ugly parts it makes people feel uncomfortable? This is the point that I really like that you made, though, that it feels like 5 minutes ago that people on the right were howling about ultra sensitive snowflakes and cancel
Yeah.
culture when woke
They weren't,
activities.
and I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
let's be honest, they weren't entirely wrong about
No,
that.
not at all.
But, they were, I mean, the Confederate statues are one thing, but people were going after books as well. I think the sort of woke movement on the left wanted to, like, I mean, there were movements, and I think there still are, to get rid of To Kill a Mockingbird or something,
Yeah.
and that goes too far. But what's happened now is, in the name of stopping these snowflakes on the left, it's a monstrous, New England sized a nor'easter that is much worse than the problem it purported to be solving, because now you've got this much more dramatic chilling effect. So I've actually, because as you mentioned it's Black History Month, I've decided, well, what do they want people to teach? So I'm going back to the 1970s textbook from Virginia, and I'm going to just excerpt it as much as
Jeez.
I can about the benevolent master.
Oh, no, really?
Yeah, but I mean, this wasn't the 1880s. This was the 1970s when this was being taught. So, I mean, I suppose if the goal is not to make any white student uncomfortable, you can tell them all about the benevolent slaveholders.
You mentioned when conservatives were making fun of the snowflakes. I mean, there were some pretty good stories out there about the colleges that were so concerned about their fragile students that if a controversial speaker came on
Yeah.
campus, they would actually have like rooms. Remember where they would
Hmm.
go and they would play with teddy bears and stuff, and they would. I mean, there were. No, I'm not making this up. They would actually like have safe spaces where you could go and you could draw on cardboard. I don't know what it was, but it was ridiculous. And now it's flipped around. We have
No,
this debate.
we need therapy animals for everybody now.
Therapy animals. So we do have a debate about what constitutes cancel culture, what constitutes
Mhm.
infringement on free speech. I mean, there are gray areas where holding people accountable for their words is
Mhm.
that an infringement on free speech, or is that just part of what of accountability? But in your column, you quoted the head of this free speech group, Penn, saying that when you think about the hierarchy of infringements on free speech, there's no question legislative prohibitions on ideology are at the top of the list. I mean, that's kind of there's a line there, right? When the law says you cannot use these books or these ideas, that seems to be pretty clear stuff.
Right, because it's backed up by the power of the state, so it affects everybody across the state, and it's generally, I think, at least in half cases, it's backed up by some sort of a mandatory punishment. So, not only do they, slap your wrist and say you shouldn't do this, you could be fired or have some other penalty brought against you. I mean, between what began with the woke left and what has been finished with the snowflakes on the right, I mean, the ones who are suffering here are the kids. I mean, I thought the whole idea of an education is to be able to confront difficult issues that do divide people, and you got to figure out what the right answer is, or maybe there's some right on both sides. But the whole point is, whatever happened to the Socratic argument as being the way that people learn. Now we must not be challenged in any way. I mean, all this is going to result in is just dumbing down America's children.
Well, and it already has. So when you wrote about the tip line in Virginia, I thought that I had not known about this before. The sort of the big helping of hypocrisy from Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia, who apparently didn't mind if some kids got an anti-racist education as long as they were his own kids.
Yes, he
So,
was he was
I
fine with
tell
that.
me about that story because this is interesting because he had taken this really uncompromising position that I'm going to protect all children from any kind of this propaganda. But it turns out that his own kids have a
Right.
rather different educational standard.
Right. So all four of his kids have gone to what are called the cathedral school. So NCS, a National Cathedral School for Girls, is where his daughter went, and his three sons went to St. Albans, which is its brother school, also under the Episcopal Church. One of them moved on to Georgetown Prep, which I think was Brett
Mm,
Kavanaugh's school, right?
yeah,
Um,
sounds
uh,
familiar.
but so somebody else has raised the point that he's still wearing a mask in school, even though Virginia kids have been told that they don't have to. But yeah, I mean, so Glenn Youngkin, it's all well and good to be for public school parents' rights. He exercised his public school parents' rights in Virginia to send his kids to elite private schools in Washington, where they received an education that I mean, I think it goes too far to say that public schools are teaching critical race theory. They're not really. It's not really an anti-racism
Mhm.
curriculum. It may be a more accurate history, but who is teaching an anti-racism curriculum that really could be considered similar to critical race theory? Well, that it would be St. Albans and the National Cathedral School. And it's not just that he was a passive parent from 2016 through the end of 2019. He was on the board of governors of the National Cathedral School when they approved a strategic plan that basically was the basis for implementing this anti-racist curriculum. I mean, they've been very progressive on these matters, going back for years. His office said, well, the schools have changed over the years. And that is
Mm.
true over the years, but they haven't changed that dramatically since he left the board. That was pretty much already baked into the cake. So, I mean, I much prefer the parent Glenn Youngkin to the governor Glenn Youngkin because he wants his kids to be in an environment where they're challenged to think and maybe be uncomfortable, maybe have to grapple with divisive issues. So it seems to me that he should extend the same benefits to public school kids in Virginia, but he's going to protect them from that.
So when we're talking about elite schools, these are the elite of the elite schools, St.
Yes, no, these
Albans.
are
I
yeah,
mean, these
these
are, I
are
mean, do you know how much they cost to go there? I mean, it's
oh
like for
yeah,
people,
they're north of 40,000. I think we're
I
in the
mean,
fifty
these
thousand a
are
year range. Yeah.
very Tony. And
In
as
fairness, that wasn't a big stretch for Youngkin. He was
no, no, no.
from the
He can
Carlisle group.
afford it, and I, of course, am not a critic of private education, but it is interesting that these schools were quite, forward-leaning, aggressive in pushing anti-racism. As you point out, that at St. Albans, they promote on their website books like White Fragility,
Mhm,
Critical Race Theory and Introduction,
mhm,
Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning, the Definitive History
mhm.
of Racist Ideas. Faculty are instructed to read Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Right.
I mean, this is full frontal CRT stuff.
Right, I
I
mean, you
mean,
can
this
argue
is
what
yeah,
is
right.
or isn't,
Yeah.
but there's no argument. That is
No, no.
CRT. That's the definition of it.
Yeah, when you're talking about Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, why it's so hard for white people to talk about racism. I mean, this is literally the CRT, and so this is Glenn Youngkin's kids' school. So, what I
It's
yeah,
not the
man,
first time you and I have encountered hypocrisy,
no,
in
do
this
it.
field, but it's a particularly delicious one, uh, since it's not that he was just as I said, it's not just that he was a passive parent. He was right there in the mix as this stuff was being put into place.
So, look, you and I could both spend all of our time just writing about hypocrisy. I
Sure.
was looking at two maps today, speaking of hypocrisy, and I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of gerrymandering and everything, but reading this passionate denunciation of how terrible gerrymandering was. And I was looking at one of the recent maps to come out of New York and another one coming
Mhm.
out of Maryland. I know that
Yeah.
people hate the both sides ism argument,
Uh-huh.
but guys, there's nothing new about gerrymandering, and literally, it is both political parties that are
Mhm.
doing it. Now, again, it's maybe the fact that Democrats would like to pass federal legislation. Perhaps that is the crucial distinction. But the fact is that both these parties weaponize this and have been doing it
Mhm.
for a very, very long time. Nobody's posing for holy pictures right now.
Yeah, I agree with you for the most part on that. I mean, there are a couple of issues. One is there are more Republican controlled states. So, by
Mhm.
definition, it's going to be happening more there. But the other, we've heard this a little bit on the issue of, super PACs and dark money. And, you've seen stuff in the Times saying, oh, the Democrats, they're
Right.
taking dark money and doing all this. But I agree. They shouldn't be taking dark money, but nobody, in my view, should be taking dark money. So the question is, if this is how the game is played, and the Supreme Court, whether it's with
Right.
Citizens United or whether it's blessing gerrymandering, if they say this is the law of the land, you're kind of a fool if you don't do it.
Sure. It's like being a football player and deciding that you're not going to be using the forward pass. I mean, if
Right,
this is it, you
right.
have to do it.
I object to it in principle.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
That's not the way we wanna play the game. Well, that's the way we play the
Yeah.
game.
So I
S
mean, I guess the defense for the Democrats would be saying they would prefer to get rid of dark money, and they would prefer to get rid of gerrymandering, super PACs, the whole thing. But they're playing the cards they've been dealt. But I mean I agree. It's ugly. It's
Yeah,
ugly no matter who does it.
well, it is ugly, and I have actually changed my position on gerrymandering over the years. I kind of shrugged for a while, and now, I think it's hard not to recognize the degree to which it has really added to the toxicity and the tribalization of our politics, because there are so few competitive districts,
Exactly. That's what had happened in this last round. I mean, I think Democrats were thinking, oh, they're going to take away all these seats from us. Republican states didn't really do that. What they've done is insulated their potentially vulnerable seats so that they will be immune from challenges now and very likely for the next decade. So I think we're down to 25, seats that you could
That's
even,
mind-boggling.
marginally say are, competitive out of 435. And the problem is, as you know, it's not just that they're because they're not competitive between the parties. The only thing that matters is the primary.
That's right.
And unfortunately, the ones who are winning primaries now are whoever can, shall we say, quote Voltaire the best.
Well, all politics is primary politics now. I mean, that's what it's come down to, is that if you're a
Right, and it,
Republican,
it rewards the extreme. Yeah,
yeah, you don't have to worry about Democrats. You don't have to worry about, probably minorities. You don't have to worry about centrist voters. You just have to win that primary, and you win the primary by being the craziest son of a bitch on the
right.
ballot, as Thomas Massey
Yeah.
famously once said.
Right. And when you say, "Boy, all these guys are crazy," well, yeah, not really. They're perfectly rational. they're doing what it takes to get elected and stay elected. They are, they're playing the game properly.
Yeah, I mean, you see that, obviously, Ohio being the most, dramatic example, but I think you're seeing it played out everywhere in the country. And, when people say, well, when are Republicans going to speak out against the craziness? Well, it's when they're not looking over their shoulder looking at a primary. Because uh, so
Yeah.
let's talk about the coup, the what we've learned about the coup. It
Hmm.
feels like there's this cascade of information, and I don't want to just blow past it. That you have the former president of the United States, dangling pardons for insurrectionists, seditionists, rioters, with the implication that anyone that commits an act of political violence, on his behalf, going forward as well, might be taken care of. I mean, it's so, part of the thing that's it's amazing is that if this was uncovered in tapes, secret
Hmm.
tapes, it would be the biggest scandal ever. He just does it in public, in broad daylight. He just says, "Yes, you elect me, and I will pardon all of you." What the
Or
hell?
you don't even have to elect him. You could
Yeah.
just install him with violence, and he will pardon you. You can skip the whole election thing. Yeah, I mean, it's long ago it sort of lost its capacity to shock, and I suppose the shocking thing would be that if Stephen Miller or somebody else hadn't drafted executive orders saying we must seize the voting machines, uh, but it's the environment is now that anything that comes out of that January 6th committee, a large chunk of the country will be conditioned to say, it's politics. I don't believe any of that. So we're in, this bizarre moment where you will care about it, I will care about it, and arguably, half the country will care about it, but the other half is just going to convince them that everything, all news is fake. But it has been an astonishing avalanche of
Well, let me
revelations.
bounce this off of you, because we have spent the last 6 years going, "Oh my God, that's incredible," or maybe this is the turning point, or this is the breaking
Mhm,
point, and it never is. But the craziness has been ramping up. Trump clearly is running for office. He has no other agenda really, other than to relitigate his own, gripes. He's crazier and more reckless all the time. There are these voices out there. You have Larry
mhm,
Hogan out there saying that he might run for president. You have
mhm.
Asa Hutchinson, the governor of Arkansas, of all places, saying he shouldn't be allowed back in office. I mean, they're very much outliers. And then there are some people writing columns, looking at the polls, and, if you squint the right way, does it look like he's maybe losing his grip on the party? I guess how much of that
Yeah.
is wish casting, and how much of that is maybe that there is kind of a Trump fatigue, out there. What do you think?
I here's how I'd look at it is there may or may not be a Trump fatigue, but it's almost beside the point because it's Trumpism. There doesn't appear to be any fatigue there.
No.
If you look at DeSantis, or even if you look at Youngkin, I mean, Trump himself, I mean, arguably would be less of a threat because he's more bumbling than a DeSantis. I mean, Trump did not succeed with some of his worst instincts simply because of incompetence. So the fact that, there are tip lines in Virginia to report on your teachers, coming from this, mainstream, what I think previously would have been viewed as a moderate a businessman. I mean, that to me is more alarming than the perfectly to be expected pronouncements out of Trump about pardoning the violent. It
Huh.
seems to me that it's just taken over. So yeah, we for 5 6 years we thinking this will finally be the moment, but I think it's pretty obvious that that moment is not going to come.
It's
There's
it's an
there's no critical mass left to make that moment happen.
No, I agree with that take. Now, I have confessed that maybe I don't have the clearest view of this because I still suffer from PTSD, and so we'll never underestimate the craziness or indulge in irrational hopes and expectations. But even when you look at these polls, and so he may be under 50%, but he's still at 40%. Look, you need an overt act to take him down. Tim Miller had a great piece yesterday. Look, at some point some Republicans in key positions are going to have to be willing to take some political pain to
Mhm.
be able to push back to do something about it. And I don't know that they're willing to commit those overt acts to stop him. But you raise an interesting question here, which I don't think I've thought through completely. Are you feeling right now that in some ways, well, I think you just said this, that in some ways a more competent Trumpist is actually scarier than the real thing, than
I
Trump
would
himself? Because Trump we know is kind of bumbling and incompetent and crazy and known quantity. So are you saying that the
right.
next generation might be worse than him?
Well, I think so. I mean, and because Trump is vulgar and sort of a buffoon. So some people who might even like some of the more authoritarian instincts just don't like the mannerisms. But think about somebody like DeSantis, who I think is much smarter than Donald Trump is. Uh, um, I mean, I think he's setting up, or proposing to set up, this special police force reporting only to him, that will be have free reign. It sounds like, to rove around polling places, and just looking for some problems or irregularities. But obviously, anybody looking at this would know that that's all about voter intimidation. Um, y- you know, so I think something like that is more dangerous. I think that there's somebody who potentially could have the charisma of Trump, but sort of the brains of Stephen Miller. I think that's much more. I mean, Trump is a known commodity, and there's built-in opposition to him by arguably a majority of the American public. So I don't want to be out here saying, boy, I really hope Donald Trump is the Republican nominee, but. Uh,
Well, the other point is leaving aside the personalities. I mean, the forces that have been unleashed. It is like they thought it was a controlled burn, and now it's turned into this massive conflagration that no individual can actually control anymore, and it's taking on bizarre different forms. And I'm not sure that even Trump. Well, I know that. I mean, Trump himself knows that he can't get too far out ahead of that
mhm.
of his own people or any other political figure out there, and you've seen this on issue after issue. So the unleashing of what, for lack of a better term, we could call Trumpism, we may need to come up with some different
Mhm.
term for that at some point. I think that's become more virulent, and he disappears from the political scene tomorrow, and that does not go away. We don't have a return to normalcy.
No.
Again, this feels like an old story, but I mean, your thoughts, Susan Collins, who's voted once in the second impeachment. She's not up for another 6 years. She's asked on Sunday morning television, would you close the door to supporting him? She can't answer the question.
Mhm.
I mean, if Susan Collins, I mean, that just seems to me to be such a canary in the coal mine. If Susan Collins, who is moderate and reasonable and always concerned about everything, who's actually voted to
Mhm.
convict him, if even she can't say that the morning after he dangles pardons, then
Right.
what? What are
Yeah,
we
I
waiting
well,
for?
I had that same sense after Lamar Alexander,
Yeah,
announced his retirement. Like, well, what's he got to lose? I
right.
mean, yeah, Lamar Alexander, he can't possibly be on board with this. I mean, my feeling is that because this is where even the country club uh, Republican base has gone, where the Chamber of Commerce base has gone. I think these individual leaders, these individual figures, it's not just sort of, it's not really even primarily political blowback. I think it's social blowback. You know, it would be like the approbation of your peers. You know, they see how Jeff Flake became a pariah. They see Liz Cheney and Kinzinger, and they don't want that to happen to them. Not, you know, not just from their colleagues in Congress, but from their friends and supporters at home. I mean, that's what I'm
I
guessing is happening.
no, I don't think you should underestimate that at all. Now, speaking of Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, the RNC is going to be taking up a resolution, apparently being pushed by Trump ally David Bossie, to expel them from the Republican Party, to formally call on the House conference to expel them, and
Mhm.
that's going to be up at the RNC committee. My level of surprise, if that passed, would be two on a scale
Right.
of 1 to 100. What?
Right, I
Yeah.
was right. Yeah, and you know what, I haven't investigated this yet, but when I saw this, I'm thinking, you know, who has that weapon been used against in history? I mean, was it used against McCarthy? He was censured.
Mhm.
I don't, you know, like what, you know, who else has been deserving of this, you know, political death penalty in history? I think it might be worth.
And the
Uh,
obsession with it. It's not just that you can denounce them or criticize them. You have to keep upping the ante. You have to keep driving them out, making it very clear that we're going to excommunicate you. And again, I know this is getting old, but I just find it so ironic that the explanation we heard from all the cool kids was, well, Liz Cheney needed to be removed from leadership because she just wouldn't move on. She just
mhm.
kept talking about that election, and we need to move on to be forward facing. And then you
Right.
look at everything that's happened now. Donald Trump will absolutely not let them move on. He is not moving on, people. Right?
No, we're not moving on. Although the, you know, the truth is, even expulsion by the RNC would be pretty benign compared to what Newt Gingrich has proposed. He wants to see them locked up.
What is with
The
Newt Gingrich? What's your take? I mean, you've watched him for years.
I have. I've got a, you know, a book coming out in August on, you know, starting
Oh.
with the Republican Revolution of, you know, Gingrich's in '94. You know, and I'm obviously not the first to say this, but I think he paved the way for a lot of what we're seeing today. But you know, he quickly embraced Trump early on, and look, I mean, he's no idiot. He sees where the party is, and he wants to be out leading that parade rather than trying to turn it into another direction. So,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, it's his way of staying relevant, and you know, I mean, he got to be husband of the ambassador to the Holy See, so he must be doing something right.
Yeah, well, Newt Gingrich is one of those figures. I look back on what happened, and you think of what Sarah Palin being an inflection point, Newt Gingrich being an inflection point, all of these things, and yet it's hard to have predicted at the time that it was going to end up this particular way. But
Hmm.
yeah, the fact that he not only suggests expelling them but throwing them in prison, it's just amazing. So, before I was going to mention this before, and I wanted to double back on this since we were talking about elections and lying about elections. Obviously, the Democrats are not going to get their voting rights bills through,
Yes,
but
that's
there's a
also a
lot of
level 2 on the surprise scale of 100.
right. But there is a lot of speculation about this bipartisan gang working on fixing the Electoral Count Act.
Hmm.
They have 9 Republicans. They don't have 10 yet,
Hmm.
but they are working on, fixing that bill, which in a rational world would be the lowest of lowest hanging fruit. Fix that screwed up piece of legislation. What do you think? Politico is saying that the Biden White House is keeping hands off, that they are completely AWOL. They don't want to have anything to do with it. A lot of Democrats are worried that somehow this is a bipartisan trap.
Hmm.
But if they can't fix the Electoral Count Act, I mean, really?
Well, I mean, I could see the standoffishness at first because they didn't want it as an
Yeah.
excuse not to do anything else. But I think it's it's pretty clear that, you know, that ship has sailed. So yeah, it's a very minor fix to prevent an exact repeat of what happened last time, which wouldn't stop a similar thing from happening in any number of other ways. But sure, why not? It's better than not doing anything.
Yeah, that
So
seems to me to be pretty clear. So give me your take on Joe Biden right now. We're now more than a year into his presidency. I think he started off with a lot of projected optimism about what
Mhm.
kind of a president he would be, what kind of agenda he would have, and yet here we are. And of course, the polls and the conventional wisdom kind of line up that he's in a world of hurt.
Yeah, I think he is. I think anybody would have been. And, Charlie, when you look at, you could step back and say, hey, we just had the strongest economic growth since, Morning in America, 1984. And yeah, inflation is higher than it was then, but not, not hugely so. But the mood of the nation is dramatically different. And, of course, some of that's this, never ending pandemic. But I just think that the political culture that has been created means there's a ceiling for Biden or for anybody else. It's going to be somewhere around 50%, low 50s in approval. There's probably a floor of 30%, on somebody on either side, and then it's sort of approval will be the few sort of persuadable people in the middle, but. Look, he gets terrible press. He has been ineffective. I don't think that's a statement on Biden. I think it's a
Hmm.
statement that everything is broken. I do not suppose that if he started from the very beginning saying, I just let me just sit down with Mitch McConnell and see what we can get done, that he'd be sitting on any accomplishment that he's not sitting on now.
So are you saying that no one can be a success, that we were just in an era now where we're just not gonna ever have a successful president, or not ever, but that no one could succeed in this environment?
That's my sense.
Mm.
Certainly nobody's going to be popular the way even a George W. Bush was, or even an Obama
Briefly.
was early. Yeah,
Yeah.
briefly, right. I mean, they've all been brief, but
Yeah.
or I mean, think about Bill Clinton. During impeachment, he had very low favorability ratings, but he had very high job approval ratings because people reacted to the economy. Now people react to the economy based on the party you're in, and we have an election that changes, and everybody completely changes their view of the economy, and you can see it now, and if you look at actual spending, purchasing, people are feeling pretty good if you look at it in the aggregate. But if you ask people how things are, they say it's terrible. So
They're
I
in a
think
bad mood.
that's a reaction to the culture.
Okay,
So
so this is the culture, and I'm gonna call up a tweet that I wanted to get your reaction to.
if
You
it's
know,
a more Voltaire, I don't want to
no,
hear it. No.
it's not. It's not. It's
It's Mark
or
Twain.
allegedly Voltaire. Yes, Nate Cohn tweeted out a couple of hours ago. Deservedly or not, the public lost confidence in the Biden administration's competence and leadership in August. The country has had an adrift and hopeless feel since then, with no sense of direction, back to normalcy, etc. And that's what's holding back economic confidence.
Hmm.
And so, yes, I mean, obviously, we have the pandemic, we have inflation, we have other issues, but it did feel that the fiasco in Afghanistan broke something, and we never came back from that.
I think, well, certainly that was a fiasco. I don't dispute that at all. I don't think Americans are thinking at all about Afghanistan. Now, maybe it
Mhm.
left them with a
Mm.
sense of bumbling, but that was also the Delta wave,
Yeah.
which we'd never quite got out of, and then the Omicron wave. So I think it was. I think the honeymoon that Biden enjoyed was when it looked like, hey, we're getting we're getting out of this pandemic. So I think that's the largest piece that has dragged it down, as opposed to an economic one, although it obviously has an economic effect as well. But yeah, I mean that's why I think regardless of who was in office was going to be pretty much trashed by that series of events. Now, maybe because he's been so low for so long, he can't recover, even if the pandemic goes away. I mean that remains to be seen. But I mean, even if inflation were running at 1.5%, and we had annual GDP growth of 5%, if you are watching Fox News, you are certainly not going to think the economy is in good shape.
No, and they're not gonna emphasize that,
So,
no.
yeah, so I don't really see how that would I think it's almost impervious to whatever's happening in the economy.
It is interesting, and you've written about this, before, how effective Fox can be in, putting forth a negative, a negative narrative about, anything. For example, the pounding on Joe Biden for, wanting to, use the FBI to investigate parents and all of this, that he was, that all of that. But also the way that they have really weaponized his age. And this has been something they just pounded and pounded, and I spent a little bit of time in conservative media, and how that is sort of the background noise to everything.
Mhm,
And, but when you start to see weakness,
mhm,
you know what I'm saying?
yeah,
They have created this template so that every time he stumbles that you might not have noticed before, suddenly
right,
it's like,
right,
"Aha, okay, this is what I've been hearing." It plays
yes.
to this, and they have really pounded this.
And it works. I mean, you're
Yep,
seeing it. I mean,
it
I see it
does.
in my emails, and I mean, you see it not just on the right now, but on independent voters, and I think even Democratic voters are worried about his age. And yeah, I mean, you can see exactly how it happens. The guy, as has a stutter, and you can see when he is having trouble with a word, and he sort of shuts his eyes and blinks.
Yeah.
He's trying to pronounce the word. And those of us who've watched Joe Biden in the 80s and 90s and aughts know that this is the exact same guy we were watching then, who would put his foot in his mouth repeatedly and say all kinds of ill-advised things. So, but yes, now it's been put through the lens of being a result of his age. Now, I mean, I think it's entirely possible that he's not. I'm in my 50s and I'm not as
Mhm.
sharp as I was. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if he's not as sharp as he once was. But like he held a news conference for an hour and three quarters.
Yeah.
And okay, well, he kind of gave away Ukraine for a
Yeah.
minute there,
There was a bad moment there.
but just for a brief minute. But I mean, somebody who is in the grips of dementia could not get through an hour and three-quarter news conference.
No, see, I didn't see, I agree with Will Salatin in this. I don't think that he has dementia. I don't think he's losing mental, but he's slowing down in his ability
Mhm,
to, express himself, and again,
mhm.
anyone who reaches a certain age recognizes that. Doesn't
Yeah,
mean he's not gonna make the right decisions or that he doesn't understand the issues, but
yeah.
it's a PR problem. So since we started off with Thomas Massie tweeting,
Hmm.
so Massey tweets about Voltaire. He's quoting the Nazi pedophile instead. And then he continues, of course, tweeting because he wants that sweet, sweet dopamine hit of Twitter likes.
Hmm.
And just yesterday, he retweeted Matt Gaetz, who tweeted, "Thus begins another week of the Silver Alert presidency." So you have congressmen tweeting and then retweeting sort of snide silver alert presidency jokes. So
Hmm.
we see where this goes, and
There's
I,
an obvious joke to be made when you said that he tweeted a pedophile and then he tweeted Matt Gates, but I'm not going there.
we wouldn't want to do that because
We would
we
not do
wouldn't
that.
want we
That would be
wouldn't want to
irresponsible.
prejudge.
Right.
Maybe it's just he figures, okay, so this guy may be a neo-Nazi arrested for child pornography, but Matt Gates, she was 17. I don't know where we're
Yeah,
going
it's
to go.
fine, it's fine.
We could have gone on for another 4 hours here, but I really appreciate you coming back on the podcast. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed it greatly. Thank you, Charlie.
And thank you all for listening to today's Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We'll be back tomorrow, and we will do this all over again.